This is the first of a series of videos that I'm going to be producing on a condition called JIA, or Juvenile Idiopathic Arthritis. It is an autoimmune condition, and it is a condition that our son has. Our son Grayson is 8 years old, and he is currently undergoing treatment for this condition, for which he was first diagnosed 2.5 years ago when he was about 6.5 years old. So JIA, Juvenile Idiopathic Arthritis. Idiopathic means of unknown origin, although certainly it is genetic and it is hereditary in some way, shape, or form. The latest that I have heard is that it is based probably on a cluster of genes. Arthritis is a condition, it's a general term that means inflammation of the joints. The root arthritis, means joint, and itis, I-T-I-S, means inflammation. So juvenile, youth under the age of 18, I believe, juvenile idiopathic arthritis. Now in Grayson's case, he has Oligoarticular JIA, which oligoarticular is again two roots. Oligo meaning a small number, in this case fewer than 4, and articular refers to the joints again. Basically, articulation is a place where two bones touch. So, a small number of his joints are involved in this process. In his case, it is 2 knees. It turns out that polyarticular JIA is kind of a different condition with a much more serious prognosis, a much different outcome. So in his case, oligoarticular, small number of limbs involved. The lucky thing, maybe the luckiest thing about his condition, if you could ever call any autoimmune condition a lucky thing, is that he's likely to outgrow it. I know people who have polyarticular JIA, where they have multiple joints around their body that are involved in the process, and in their case, they are expected to continue to have symptoms into adulthood and perhaps continuing to be a lifelong disability. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about how we came to the original diagnosis of JIA, and it's kind of a longish story. So in the next video, I'll kind of take the story from there and start talking about the treatment plan and what we continue to find out further about his condition. All right. So we actually knew from the time that he was about 5 years old, we knew that there was something going on with his legs. But apparently, like many other parents, we put it down to growing pains. He would especially complain about pain in his legs, and he was complaining about pain in his lower legs, which, like the sural region, the back of the calf, especially after a long road trip. And he usually complained about it only on the left side, as I recall. There was one particular road trip, it was in March of 2018, where he was complaining and moaning and just about on the point of tears with the pain that he was experiencing. And I said, well, look, I don't know what this is. I have no idea. It doesn't seem to be growing pains, but I will bring it up at the next pediatrician's appointment when he goes for his annual checkup. So, June comes around, June of 2018, and I brought it up with the pediatrician, and the pediatrician looked at his knees, which right away I thought, well, that's odd. He was complaining about pain in his lower legs, but the pediatrician was looking at his knees. And it turns out he probably was looking for JIA, as it happens. But he never mentioned, I don't think he mentioned the words JIA or any kind of arthritis or anything like that. And he said, there doesn't seem to be anything wrong today. He said if he continues to complain about pain, if he has another episode like this, then be sure to bring him back and we will take another look. Fast forward about 6 months, it was the day after Thanksgiving. And he was complaining about his legs again, and he hadn't complained in a while. And he had just been hanging out with his cousins the day before, and they were wrestling and running up and down stairs and running around outside, and I thought maybe he twisted his ankle. At the time, I didn't realize it was his knee. He was still saying it was his lower leg. He was again on the point of tears. He was really in pain, and I wanted to make sure that I believed him, that he knew that I believed him, and that I was going to take care of him. And so I thought, well, what's the harm? I'll take him to the pediatrician, What's the worst that can happen? It'll be a copay. So they had morning hours. They had a morning clinic that day, so I took him over to the morning clinic, and he saw a pediatrician. And as soon as she saw his knees, she said, they're really swollen. And then I looked at his knees and I said, they are really swollen. And of course, I hadn't been looking at his knees because he'd been complaining about his lower leg. And then as soon as she said that, I said, is it your knees? Do your knees hurt? And he said, yes, it's my knees. I'm thinking, all this time you've been complaining about... Anyway, so yes, it was his knees, and she recommended that we go to an orthopedic surgeon. At the time, I guess what I was thinking was, it's probably a twisted knee, and she just wants to make sure there's no damage. So we went to the orthopedic surgeon that afternoon, and it was quite busy, but we got an appointment in there. They kind of squeezed us in. And as soon as this physician looked at Grayson's knees, I could see it in his face that he actually knew what it was right away. He didn't, I don't think he called it anything at the time. He might have, I don't really remember. But I could tell that he knew what it was. So either he had seen this condition previously on a patient, or he had, attended seminars in medical school or attended seminars at a medical conference or something like that, and he knew exactly what it was. So what happens with JIA, it's an autoimmune condition, and the body starts to attack. With all autoimmune conditions, it's a situation where the body begins to attack itself. In the case of JIA, what the body is attacking are synovial membranes. So you have a number of joints in your body where bones move against each other. It's called a movable joint, or a diarthrosis. And when you have a diarthrosis, you have this movement, and you can't have you have to have some kind of lubrication in between the two bones. So, for example, in the knees, you have a tibia basically resting on top of the femur. And in order to allow for free movement between them, there are a number of structures in place. But one of the things that's in there is synovial fluid. It's basically like motor oil. It keeps everything lubricated. It's this egg whitey, syrupy, clear substance. So the synovial fluid is produced by synovial membranes in these movable joints. So the body, in the case of JIA, the body begins to attack the synovial membranes, and as a result, the synovial membranes output tons of synovial fluid. Now, the synovial fluid is meant to stay right in that capsule between the two bones, but in the case that there's so much of it, it can't stay in there. It basically pushes up. It pushes up. And there is a particular look to it. Of course, now I've looked up images of this condition. And the fluid doesn't tend to go downward, it tends to come proximally up the leg, and the fluid sort of creates the pocket basically just expands upward. And so it has a particular look to it. A big knee, kind of an enlarged thigh, with the lower leg actually not involved at all. The next steps were we had to go see a pediatric specialist, and we ended up seeing a specialist that I never heard of before called a Pediatric Rheumatologist. And there are no pediatric rheumatologists in our area, so we ended up making appointments with two different sets of pediatric rheumatologists, and both clinics are about an hour away from us. So we live in a bedroom community that is sort of halfway between Chicago and Milwaukee. And we were able to make an appointment about 6 weeks later for the one that was closer to Milwaukee. And about 3 weeks after that, we had an appointment for the clinic in Chicago. So it's Children's Hospital in Wauwatosa, Wisconsin, or Lurie Hospital that is in Chicago. These are both children's hospitals. Anyway, in the meantime, we basically had to gather data, and we had to gather evidence. Autoimmune conditions are notoriously difficult to diagnose, so you kind of have to take many bits of information, which thankfully we're getting better and better at diagnosing these things. But you have to gather data, and you have to, kind of strengthen your case to say, yes, indeed. So not only was it a relatively long period of time before we were able to see the specialist, but they also sort of interrogated us a little bit and made sure that it was appropriate for them to spend their time with us, basically. So we spent that ensuing 6 weeks gathering data. So the very same day that we saw the orthopedic surgeon, we had an x-ray done. And then he recommended an MRI so that we could really look at the soft tissues of the knees, and that was carried out about a week later. And then they drew blood, which they were looking for ANAs, anti-nuclear antibodies. I think that's what it's called, which is a fairly standard marker of several different autoimmune conditions. And they did find ANAs. And the MRI showed, yes, there is, this pocket of synovial fluid in his leg. And additionally, they aspirated some fluid directly from the knee itself. And an aspiration of fluid from a joint goes like this. You basically just stick a big needle in there and withdraw fluid. Now, we were having all of these tests done in local area hospitals and clinics and wherever we could, get the special, wherever we could get the tests done. Because at that point, we did not have an affiliation with a children's hospital. So we were working with physicians and specialists who mostly worked with teenagers and adults. At the time, Grayson was only 6 years old. These people were not really trained to work with children. And I've since come to realize the unfortunate truth about that is that when you work with people who are pediatric specialists, the comfort of the child is a preeminent concern. But for people who are normally working with teenagers and adults, they're not really thinking so much about the unexpected pain that a child would feel or the fact that their minds aren't logical about it. Anyway, we had a blood draw that was very, very unfortunate because it might have been his first blood draw ever, come to think of it, and they couldn't find a vein, and they were poking around inside of there, and he was miserable. The aspiration of fluids from his knees went terribly. They ended up having to pin him down. The orthopedic surgeon was there, and then he had two assistants pinning him down. He had one at first, and then he called for another one to come in. And he was screaming, and blood was squirting, and the needles were. It was pretty ugly. So, unfortunately, we had to have these tests done by the local people because we had to build our case, and we had to kind of prove to these pediatric rheumatologists that yes, our child did need to see them. We were treating him with Motrin. I started giving him Claritin because I asked the doctor, and they're like, I might as well try it, because that was something that helped when he's very allergic to mosquitoes, so his mosquito bites get very large, but Claritin actually prevents a lot of that. So we were doing what we could to kind of take this swelling and make it smaller. His limping was terrible. He couldn't get out of bed one morning, and I had to keep him home from school, which was a great concern. And the weird part about it was that he would wake up in the morning unable to walk, great difficulty walking, lots of limping, very swollen knees, and then just a few hours later, he would be fine and walking around, and if you didn't know there was anything going on with him, you wouldn't even see that he was just the slightest limp. We are incredibly grateful to the school nurse who helped us through this time, who gave us advice about things like, he wasn't able to walk up the stairs of the bus in the morning, so I started taking him into school and literally carrying him from the car into the school, and then the school nurse would meet us with a wheelchair, and Grayson was embarrassed about using the wheelchair at first, but he got used to it, and after a while, of course, he kind of liked it. It was just an efficient way for him to be able to be transported around the school. One kind of unusual little extra symptom that he had a rash on the back of his knee. So the primary concern was his left knee. It turns out both of his knees are involved, but his left knee was definitely the one that was affected the most. It was definitely the one that he noticed the most. And on the back of that knee, he had a rash, like a bright red rash on the back of his knee. It's never really been an answer as to what that was, but I just bring it up because I saw it in my notes here, and I forgot about it until this very moment, but it was something that would come back, it would be gone one day, and then bright red the next day, and sometimes it would itch, and sometimes it would hurt, and sometimes it didn't feel like anything, but we found that maybe that was a side effect of the condition as well. So January 3rd of 2019, we saw a pediatric rheumatologist. It's at a teaching hospital, a children's hospital in Wauwatosa. It's a teaching hospital. So there were a lot of people in the room that day. They were able to actually diagnose him that day, which again, so lucky. he had so many symptoms that pointed in the direction of JIA that it was pretty easy for them to actually make that diagnosis. The only real problem that the specialists had was that was a little bit difficult to diagnose the condition was that they were surprised that he hadn't been diagnosed earlier. At the time, I have it in my notes, they told me that normally this condition is diagnosed around the age of 2, kind of right around the time when you'd expect a child to be learning to walk and then starting to notice these mobility issues. So the fact that he was diagnosed for the first time at 6.5 was a little unusual. They also said that it was unusual for a boy to have this condition because it happened more often to girls. However, I've read papers since then saying that they're trying to do away with that kind of language, that it does definitely happen to boys plenty, but the age was unusual. And since then, I've realized that there's also children who are older, like 9, 10, 11, 12, sort of hitting their preteen years. They can be diagnosed for the first time. So it seems as though it's a condition that's diagnosed around the age of 2 or 3, or maybe 1, I don't know, around the age of 2. And then in the preteen years. But for him to be diagnosed for the first time at 6.5 was a little bit unusual. But thankfully, all of his other symptoms pointed to the idea that yes, he has this condition. They looked at every single one of his movable limbs and never found another problem. So it really was just the 2 knees. And so it's oligoarticular. And they spent a lot of time with us that day, answering a lot of our questions, probably an entire hour. It's an episodic condition. He experiences episodes, although really he's just had one. One could argue that he did have small episodes prior because he did experience pain in his legs at various times when we were on road trips, for example. So he does have kind of like symptoms that come and go. So it's an episodic condition. And in this case, he's been experiencing this episode that was his most dramatic episode. He's been experiencing it for about 2.5 years now. And the only thing left to do from that point was to find a treatment. Which, by the way, at the time, I was just like, yeah, give us a pill. Give us a pill. Let's get rid of it. 2.5 years later, we have made many, many discoveries about this condition. But that will be for another video.